Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on creating trust in the software supply chain. I'm Christina Cardoza, news editor of SC Times. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. First, this webinar will be recorded and available on demand through the sctimes.com website in about 24 hours after the event. Secondly, if at any time you have any questions about or during the presentation, you may submit them using the Control Panel's Questions tab. Here at SC Times, we know the benefits that open source software brings to organizations in terms of being able to move faster, reduce costs, and attract talent. But open software also opens up a lot of risks. Today's webinar will go over the importance of an open source bill of materials, compliance and risk management trends, how to create an open source management program, and more. Here to discuss this further is Mark Giese and Michael Luchuk. Mark is the Director of Open Source Programs at Wind River Systems, and Michael is the Manager of Professional Services at Flexera. So now to get things started, I'll throw it over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Christina. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. Also, thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak here today. Let me begin with saying that open source software has definitely changed the world. It powers tens of millions of devices, and today companies that aren't normally thought of as software companies are indeed software companies. Certainly, there have been growing pains over the years for companies trying to transition to open source. There is a learning curve around open source use, its management, and also the importance of not only getting involved, but also staying involved with the open source community. These growing pains apply specifically to industries like telco, automotive, manufacturing, healthcare, as well as recent regulatory requirements, which Mark will talk to shortly. The open source maturity is seen most prominently in the tech world today. You wouldn't find anyone who hasn't heard of open source or who hasn't used it. According to Gartner, 95% of IT organizations leverage open source software assets. That's an exclamation point on the importance of open source. That also emphasizes the efforts many companies go through to gain that competitive advantage through endless possibilities, collaboration, adaptability that it brings to the table. And what stands out here in this comment here, and that's the last line, whether they know it or not. As you can see from this slide, the code can come from various places. There's your code that you write yourself. Let's call that proprietary code. You also have code that comes from contractors, from partners, from suppliers, various projects, the build system, all the code that you pull in. So code can come from anywhere. And it also consists of a variety of different flavors. There's the source code, the binaries, dependencies, cut and paste code, and so forth. So because of all this, and because of the fact that code comes from various entry points, people don't really know what code they have in their code base. So because they don't know, what you don't know can hurt you. From our experience, what we typically see in most of our audit engagements is that 50 to 80%, if not more, of the code bases that we audit consists of open source software. With that, not many customers are able to produce disclosures. And when those disclosures are produced, they're not complete most of the time. Even though companies' technology depends heavily on open source, most organizations aren't properly tracking it. They're not properly tracking it. They're not properly monitoring their use of the open source and the third-party components. Our services data shows that 2%, so only 2% of the issues that we eventually uncovered in an open source software audit were actually disclosed prior to the audit start. So if you think of it from a different perspective, that's 98% of the issues that we found that were a surprise to our customers. And when you think of it, if you step back and look at a bigger picture, that's over 1.6 billion lines of code, over 50,000 issues that we found. That's pretty significant. So what this shows is really the lack of knowledge with understanding the composition of companies' code. And most likely companies are taking that increased level of risk because they don't know. So unfortunately, it's almost impossible to mitigate that risk, both IP and IP compliance and security risk, without knowing what's in your code. And open source software license compliance has never been more important. And if you take a look at the trends are taking us down the path of better clarity and tighter controls for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is to emphasize the continued importance of ongoing success of companies to manage their business and basically to produce products that meet the needs of their customers, and also to future-proof the business. Control isn't bad here in this case, because it actually, in actuality, managing software compliance empowers teams to do more, to be more creative, to be more innovative, and to produce more functionality than ever before. The place to start in the software supply chain is with, first of all, education around open source. So you educate your employees, you put a process in place, you have tools in place, and you have all that to produce an open source bill of materials. Bill of materials, we call it a BOM. It is your disclosure list. It's an assessment of what is in your code, what components you depend on, how they're being used, whether they're being distributed, security information's in there. It is really an assessment of risk. Producing a comprehensive bill of materials is perhaps one of the most important actions for development teams to take. This list is used to follow license obligations. You can use it to modify open source policies, react to published vulnerabilities, etc. A comprehensive bill of materials lets you know exactly what's in your code. So buyers know exactly what they're buying. Engineering team can see the issues that are found in the code. They can roll out patches, bug fixes in a timely manner, and security experts can get a good assessment of security vulnerabilities. So bill of materials is very, very important. And now what I'm going to do is pass it over to Mark, who will talk more in detail about the bill of materials, about the compliance, the risk trends that are shaping the use of open source today. Mark?
Great, thank you, Michael. So let me briefly introduce WinRare, the company I work for. It's very important, I think, to the context of the talk I'm going to give, because we're a very core player within multiple different supply chains. We make operating systems, and they run on over 2 billion devices. It's not the operating system you would find on your laptop, but it's the operating system for everything else. So if you were to have a smart TV or a printer, or even your car, power grids, or even aircraft you might fly, they all need an operating system. And we are one of the most integral components in these systems. And in fact, there's a good chance that each of you each day will engage with one of our devices, or I would say our customers' devices running our software. So for example, whether you send something to a printer, you're taking an elevator, or you're stopped at a traffic light. Actually, our software goes beyond the bounds of Earth, and actually we have over a dozen satellites running our software orbiting the Milky Way galaxy. The one thing I'd like to highlight, though, is that we cut across multiple different industries, therefore multiple different supply chains. And what we find is that in different supply chains, there's different levels of maturity around the use of open source. And I think there's this common theme, though, that each company that participates wants to increase their use of open source and trust that the software they're getting from their suppliers is compliant and in good health. And we're going to talk about a number of technologies that actually help build that trust within the supply chain. But one other fun fact I'd like to highlight, and again, we'll come back to this in the presentation, is we actually have not only 2 billion on Earth, but we have a monopoly of 4 on Mars. We're going to be growing our market share in 2020 when we have the landing of another Mars rover. But the most important point I want to make is this software typically runs for decades, and even the open source on there, will be updated over time. And it's really important to maintain a bill of materials over time so that you know what's on the device. With respect to this talk, we're a core supplier in many different supply chains, as I highlighted. And what has happened over time is that our customers, it's not just us being compliant by giving out our software to our customers, but our output becomes the input to their device. It's the nervous system of their product. and we have to provide additional data to enable them to be compliant as well. It's also typical for us to be audited by many different companies, and they really want to seek out whether they can trust us with respect to not just the software development lifecycle, but how we handle open source software. And so open source and actually compliance around open source is part of our value proposition. So what I wanted to do is talk about how engaging with all the different customers we have and all the, I would say, pressures they put on us to get it right, how we have adopted different technologies to help build that trust. And largely that trust is with respect to open source information sharing. And we rely on a lot of tools, such as tools that come from Flexera, to help us build that trust. One image I like to give people, particularly if they're not hardcore developers, is this understanding of how the world is today with respect to the use of open source. This is not everything, but many products today are using it 80% or more open source. And the reason why that's happening is because Linux is becoming a very dominant operating system, not just on devices, but also in the cloud. So this is also typical even of a cloud platform. And we're talking about whether you're dealing with an application, a library, an entire container, or an entire device runtime. So this is very important to understand, and this will motivate why, as Michael pointed out, the importance of a bill of materials to understand all these pieces within the product. But to see in real world examples of how this stuff has become relevant, I'm going to look at three different news stories. About a year ago, Tesla was struggling to work with their supply chain to get all the necessary source code together to comply with the GPL. Since then, they've been able to do that. But I think it's an interesting observation that it's not just your company that has to do the right thing, but it's also a function of your suppliers and your suppliers doing the right thing. When it comes to security vulnerability, open source and knowing what open source is in your product is also particularly important. In this particular news story, it was a controlled demo, but they had the ability for someone in a remote, located on a remote location, take control of a Jeep as it was driving down the road and to direct it off the road. Again, it was a controlled experiment, but they were able to demonstrate that it was feasible. And understanding not only your software that your company produces, but all that other open source and how it might be impacted by security vulnerabilities is very critical. A third example is this growing demand around software being functionally safe. We're seeing with autonomous driving cars. Just last week, I heard in the news there was another autonomous car that crashed. And that's about trying to get the software to be what they call functionally safe certified. And not only do you have to know all your code, but you've got to know about all the open source that you're bringing into the product and get that software also certified under a functionally safe certification. So there are many reasons why you want to have insight into the open source within your products. We know it's in large volume, and it's, it can have an impact in the ways these stories describe. What I'm going to do in this presentation now is focus in on a number of core technologies that have been that either have been adopted or on the verge of being adopted that help us manage the open source in our products and communicate or establish that trust between different participants in the supply chain. SPDX was introduced in 2010, and what this is a format to describe the licensing information of a given software component. And I'll go into more detail about that in a second. And then I want to move on to talk about OpenChain and how it's becoming really helpful. It's a compliance certification for your open source compliance program. And it's very important to know that when you have suppliers in the world that they're handing you software, that they have a disciplined program in place. Then we're going to talk about this kind of the leading topic I think a lot of people are discussing right now in the compliance world is around the need for better access to the bill of materials in all the different products that exist in the world. And so we're going to talk about that trend as well. One I won't go into any detail here, but I think it's worth noting is the importance of a blockchain ledger, which we've been experimenting with, that will help manage the chain of custody. It'll be able to track all the different participants in a supply chain and tell you who added which open source software when, so that if you ever had to remediate it, you know who to work with. So let me go more specific into the first three, and let's start with SPDX. For those who are not familiar with SPDX, it stands for Software Package Data Exchange, and it's really about getting a very detailed analysis of all the licensing of a particular software package at the file level. It is a Linux Foundation standard. That means that they are sponsoring it, and it's run as an open source project where many people come in who have a lot of experience with compliance and sharing compliance information to develop a specification for how you might structure data. And I'll show you an example in a second. What's particularly useful about SPDX is that when we as a company will produce and deliver a Linux operating system to our customers, which might be composed of 1,000 packages, we can provide a SPDX file per package, which gives them very detailed information. Prior to the existence of SPDX, we would deliver the software, we would do our own analysis, vet the packages, maybe reject some, but then we'd pass on whatever we had to our customer, and then they'd have to redo that whole effort. SPDX allows them to just leverage all our data and possibly build on top of it. Let's look at a quick example. So BusyBox is a very popular component that runs on Linux, and we know it to be under the GPL2, that's top level package license. However, if anybody's ever done a deep dive into BusyBox, you'll see that there are almost 800 files, and many of them under other licenses other than GPL2. And what SPDX does is it allows you to summarize that list of licenses at the file level in a single file, instead of having to rummage through 800 files each time. So let me show you an example. What we have here is a bill of materials for our Linux. And what we do is we list out every component in our Linux, and then we give out the top level license, and then we give a list of the open source licenses found inside the package. So let's go look at BusyBox. Okay, so if I go here and I open BusyBox, this is really intended to be read by computers. That's the beauty of it. You can put it into a format. Think of it as PDF. We all can share Office documents by putting it into a common format, and then that common format can be read by a PDF reader. This is similarly, we put all our licensing information into a standard format, and then everybody else can import that into their own compliance program. Even though it is meant to be machine readable, it's somewhat human friendly, but just want to make sure you understood this is not meant for human consumption. We do produce the same data in a spreadsheet as well, but sorry, let me just go and see. We saw there was a number of licenses like the BSD4 clause. You can see by searching, I can find that here's a particular file within this package, and I know it's the BSD4 clause, and I have the actual notice right here. So if I want to build this package and I want to make sure I have all the notices, the SPDX file gives you a very easy and quick way to get access to every single notice at the file level. Just to show that the diversity in licensing, we can also go and see if there's LGPL. So you can see there's a fair amount of LGPL along with GPL. Some files are what they call no assertion. That's because they're not typically source files. And just to show you again, continue down another file under a different license, and here's the license notice. This would be very useful again if you want to collect up all the notices. So that's just a quick insight into what SPDX is. And generally think about it at the component level, individual components, and this nice little manifest of all the licensing information. So SPDX has been really helpful in creating trust, in that it actually enables a lot of transparency, that when you receive software, that for each component, you're getting a list of all the licenses within that component. And it reduces the amount of rework that everybody else has to do. And so SPDX has really helped facilitate the trust between vendors sharing open source software. Another technology, this is more of a certification, OpenChain certification. Think of it as there's a compliance program, and you want to certify that your compliance program meets some basic minimum requirements. When we think of a compliance program, I break it down to very simple stages. You have source code, you have some review of that source code. I'll explain that in a little more detail in a moment. But then the output of that of a program is typically the software plus a set of compliance artifacts, right? Those are the things we prepare to make sure we satisfied all the licenses in the software. In this case, someone's delivering a set of source code, maybe notices, and potentially SPDX data. And interesting enough, even potentially the bill of materials itself, although that's not a license requirement. Now, OpenChain says, and I'm going to go over some 6 pillars of OpenChain. It says that if you have an OpenChain conforming program, that your program has a certain discipline and a certain number of controls are in place, so that your customers can trust that when you deliver the compliance artifacts, that they were prepared under that trusted system with high quality. Okay, so if we want to zoom in a little bit more about the compliance program itself, now I'm going to show you a basic workflow. OpenChain doesn't dictate any particular workflow, but this is just to highlight a little bit more about how you would go through and prepare those compliance artifacts. So typically, an organization might have an opportunity for developers to disclose the use of open source. And then from there, a bill of materials will be constructed. A very important step is to run different software composition analysis tools. For example, we use Flexera's Code Insight. And what that does is it helps you verify how well the developer has disclosed their software, but it also may identify additional ones that have been missed. And so that gives you this extra check on that the bill of materials that you prepared as part of that process was done with a certain, again, level of quality. And then what we typically will have, or you'll have a person will take the bill of materials and systematically go through that list of items, and for each one decide whether you have to deliver a notice, source code, both. And one thing I'd like to highlight is that we like to describe the output in more of a generic term as a compliance artifacts. And what we do in our products, and this is a concept that comes from OpenChain. OpenChain talks about the compliance artifacts. Just a quick example, what we provide to our customers is a list of all the third-party notice files, the software bill of materials, and additional analysis reports. And this is compliance envelope, but we'll talk about how you could put other kinds of information in based on the different activities, whether you're dealing with security or export. Okay, all right. So moving along here are the 6 pillars of the OpenChain spec, which are basically saying we expect these 6 things to be in place for any compliance program. The first one is we expect that there will be a policy, an open source policy. And then they expect that there will be a certain level of training to ensure that everybody is aware of the policy and the different processes. There's a notion that certain roles and responsibilities have been properly assigned. For example, there's going to be, obviously, there'll be developers, and there might be people who prepare compliance artifacts, and they want to make sure that you have a legal counsel in place. And then there is a very specific expectation that every compliance program will produce a bill of materials as a very explicit step. And basically, you're going through in that process we discussed a little earlier to gather up and understand all the components within the software being shipped. Now, keep in mind that it also expects that this bill of materials will be maintained over time for every single release. And then it also expects every compliance program to have a particular step where you systematically go through and prepare those compliance artifacts. And then finally, it says if you are contributing to the open source community, and again, you don't have to, then they expect that you have certain additional processes in place. But by and large, the first 5 are really what it focuses on. And if you were interested in getting your organization to become OpenChain conforming, it's a good chance that if you have a lot of these things in place already, you're pretty close to obtaining that, if not there. Okay, So let me move on. Oh, by the way, these are the current sponsors of the OpenChain project. It does function as an open source project, and the specification has been developed over time by a collection of over 200 contributors. So when we talk about OpenChain and trust, again, between two organizations, it allows one organization to feel comfortable or take comfort in knowing that when they receive those compliance artifacts, that the organization they're receiving them from has a disciplined program in place. And it is probably the case that some companies are going to be much more mature than others. We've even used the specification as an opportunity to say, all right, look, you're not OpenChain conforming 100%, but tell us where you are and where you aren't. So it gives you this way of describing your compliance program and the state in which it's in. So I think it's very powerful, because ultimately the hope is that eventually, all the suppliers will be OpenChain conforming. Then the third area I wanted to talk about in this really growing trend is the demands around the for receiving the bill of materials for a given software delivery or product even. With for a simple definition, it's basically, as you might expect, a list of all the open source components and some associated information. As Michael kind of referred to it a little earlier, it's that ability to get the open source ingredients in that product. For the sake of completeness, I've included the definition of a component, and it's really described more as this unit of software that's delivered by some supplier. Now, keep in mind, a lot of times you might grab something from an open source project, and that might be considered the supplier. But often, just as often, you're going to see suppliers are going to grab open source from several different places, maybe even cut and paste from them, create new software, and that new thing they create becomes the component. So it's not always a clean-cut open source component that's defined by a well-defined project. I like to draw analogies between the hardware world and the software world when we talk about components, because there's a certain complexity that we have to be mindful of. So for example, when you have components, hardware components, they can be in varied degrees of complexity. Obviously, you got a more sophisticated assembly built on other sub-assemblies, where you might even have the software component could be an entire car in this case. With source code, you could have it at the source, at the file level. You could have it at a library, application, container, or even entire Linux runtime. Any one of these types of software can be a software component. And therefore, when we're developing a standard to help share that information, this has to be taken into account. Okay, with respect to this growing demand, I can say the number of requests coming from our customers has more than tripled in 1 year's time around the use of a bill of materials. I would say in 2000, where we're at 2018, I was seeing approximately 3 that year, where one of our customers wrote into the contract saying, we want you to deliver, in addition to all the compliance artifacts with this open source software, we want you to provide us the bill of materials, the open source bill of materials. It's not normally a requirement of any open source license, but it does become a requirement when it's in the contract. And I would say in 2019, we're seeing about a dozen. In fact, I was just on a call this morning, and lo and behold, there was a request to include in the contract wording around the bill of materials. One of the challenges is, and we're going to talk about it, is there's no standard format for the bill of materials. That's in motion. So other things that are forcing the need for delivering an open source bill of materials are the following. There's a recent California law that's going to take effect in 2020, which says that you need to be able to have more infrastructure around supporting cybersecurity around products. That includes access control and password protections and all that stuff, but also that's going to drive the need for an open source bill of materials, because part of that law is you got to be able to maintain that software, and if there's a security vulnerability and you have something out in the field, you have to know what's stored on that device in order to be able to repair it. What's also interesting is back in October of this year, the FDA just came out with a requirement for all medical device vendors to produce a bill of materials for medical devices, largely for, again, security and management. Now, I'm going to pull up an article just to show you the kind of the dialogue they're using. So this is talking about how medical device manufacturers are now required by the FDA. And what you're going to see here is they're using wording such as this. They're using, cybersecurity bill of materials, but essentially is the software bill of materials. So I think that's a very important development as well. And then finally, the U.S. National Telecommunications and Information Administration, one of the major departments in our government, is leading an effort of about a dozen companies to develop a standard for describing a software bill of materials. And in fact, they just released last month a collection of papers describing that initiative. And their first focus was to describe the problem. You can go to the ntia.gov the SBOM is the software bill of materials, and you can see a lot of the work that's being done there. And what I'm guesstimating is that because of their initiative, we will see a standard published in 2020. So let me just come back to emphasize, when we have a compliance program, we talked about how OpenChain requires you to produce a bill of materials. Everybody's expected to have one. And the idea is that oftentimes it's viewed as a secondary task, but what it has to do now is become a primary task. And that has to be done with a certain level of quality. And if you don't, then you're going to see a number of other tasks suffer. So let me give you an example. So not only is that going to be very useful for license compliance, which many of you probably are very familiar with, and some of you might be also very familiar with security vulnerability management, where you actually need to understand which components are installed, and if there's a security issue logged against it, you want to know whether you have to upgrade it or not. But also, there's export. I don't know how many people you have to deal with export compliance, but pretty much anytime you ship software out of the country, you have to make sure it complies with certain government regulations. And one of the big problems there is when their developers are pulling in all this open source, you have to make sure that you can include that open source in the submission for your export compliance. And so typically you didn't write the software, and that usually involves understanding all the cryptography used. Now, if your developers wrote the software, they would typically know what cryptography is in their code. But when they're pulling in 80% of the components to be open source, they didn't write the code, then you have to have an understanding of the bill of materials so that you can systematically go through each of those components to make sure you're complying with the export rules. And I talked a little bit earlier about the safety certification. So if you want to get your software to be certified under different standards, you have to put your software through a number of different checks. Well, if 80% of your software is open source, then you're going to need to know what that software is. In other words, you need to make sure it's governed by the same regulations as well to certify that software. And then the fifth point here, which I find really particularly useful for us, and we just engaged with Flexera. We were recently looking at acquiring a company, and we didn't want to receive the source code, but we worked with Flexera to have them receive the source code under an NDA, conducted a forensics analysis of the code, and they delivered back to us a bill of materials with respect and a report on each component with respect to its risk. So that was really great because we're just receiving the bill of materials. We were able to evaluate the software without being exposed to the software. And then we were able to make certain assessments. And that's where, again, having a bill of materials is really critical. And I guess the point to also emphasize is, if the quality of the bill of materials is not high, then neither will the output of these activities. The old garbage in, garbage out analogy, well, that's also true for here. And I guess I'm trying to emphasize how important we all need to start paying attention to managing this new kind of data set. And if I click on here, this is where I see our customers are going in terms of us delivering additional information. I showed you a little earlier how we can pull up an SPDX file, but you can imagine for each of the components here, you can systematically click on here and get the notice file, click on here and get the source code, click on here and get the SPDX data, get here a report on the security issues that might be logged against it, export related data, as well as the M&A report, right? So this is where we're going, and we're seeing that the world is going. Now, the challenge we have in the world is there still isn't a standard yet. And that standard is badly needed. But if there was a standard, then all that information I just showed you in that report could be easily represented inside a common data structure. And then that information can be presented any which way you wanted. What I just showed you before is this is just a presentation of the data. But once we have a standard, then we will be able to create any kind of presentation of that data we want. Maybe only provide 1 or 2 columns as opposed to 5. Also, it's important to note that if one particular supplier in the supply chain doesn't produce a quality bill of materials, it can impact everybody that follows them. And so, and the other challenge is if everybody's publishing it in their own format, it becomes very inefficient for us to incorporate someone else's bill of materials. So if you're dealing with half a dozen suppliers, they each are giving you under a different format, that's particularly painful because it's hard to consolidate all that data because you need to pass it on. So this need for a standard is definitely high, and again, as I mentioned, I believe it's on its way. And also, finally, in order to produce a quality bill of materials, it's having a proper program in place, but it's also the tooling and having good enough tooling to help you do that forensics analysis to really get a good insight into what is the correct components that should be in that list. And that concludes my part of this presentation. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Michael.
Thank you, Mark. If you can please advance the slide. Thank you. So in closing, when it comes to the open source management and producing the most detailed, the most complete bill of materials, as Mark pointed out, it is done to establish that and create that trust. It is better accomplished through some sort of an open source program that is complete with cross-functional support and policies that meet that strategic needs of the organization. Everything starts by having a clear understanding of where and how you're using that open source software. There are many questions that need to be answered, and it's important to always revisit these questions on an ongoing basis. Nothing is static, so your business changes, your code changes, processes to address open source management can and should change as well. They should change and evolve. So get your developers, get your legal team, security, engineering, third-party suppliers, get them all involved in the process. Always, you always want to know as much as possible about the open source use. You want to ask yourself questions. Some of the questions are written here. So where is it coming from? Who, the open source software, who wrote it? What is the license? Are there no issues with it? Have those issues been fixed or addressed? Always being on top of this, it creates trust both internally and externally with your teams, with customers, and with partners. Mark, one more slide, please. And before we go to Q&A, let me quickly summarize some key takeaways from today's presentation. So, open source use is growing. It is not slowing down. It is, the use is growing, the regulatory requirements are coming up. It's important in today's open source environment to be able to construct a detailed bill of materials. It's important for ongoing open source management success. Software composition analysis is also an important technology asset to any company, really. You get the right technology, it enables you to address not just the growing number of compliance regulations, but it will effectively help you produce that bill of materials. Trust in the open source supply chain is a must in today's environment. You may get asked, by anyone to produce that bill of materials. You can have your customers ask you. You can have your CEO, your board members, legal team, suppliers, partners. Anyone can ask you to produce that bill of materials. It's a fair game. You want to lead by example. You want to create that trust outside and within regarding your open source management practices, which leads directly to the idea that poorly managed and poorly executed program can have a significant impact on your open source and devalue it. It really only takes one incident. So know what's in your code, because what you don't know can really hurt you. So with that, let's go to questions, please.
Great presentation, guys. Yep. So we're now going to open the webinar to any questions. This first one is for you, Mark. You touched upon this briefly earlier, but can you reiterate the differences between an SPDX file and a bill of materials?
Sure. So SPDX is really a manifest or a deep, detailed record of a given component. A bill of materials is a list of a collection of components. And what we're finding is that the SPDX is a valuable piece of information about that component, but we also expect each component to have additional kinds of information, which I highlighted a little earlier, to have potentially security information or M&A information in it. So that SPDX is a single kind of data point for a given component. Now, I think it's also worth noting that the SPDX initiative has been looking at how they can evolve SPDX to serve more as this listing of components, not just this detailed dive on a single component.
Great, thanks, Mark. And just to remind the attendees, if you have any questions about any of the topics brought up today, you can use the control panel's questions tab to ask them now. I have another one for you, Mark. You brought up on one of your slides, blockchain. So can you expand on what you were thinking here and how do you think it's going to help in 5 years?
So ultimately, we're seeing, as I've tried to emphasize, that this need for trusting each other more and more in the supply chain, all the different partners. And of course, if I do something and I give it to my customer, they may trust me, but how do they know they can trust the people I've trusted? Right? And so I've built on top of others. So the blockchain is really useful when you want to have that insight into the chain of custody, meaning who did what, where, and when within the supply chain. And that's what it gives you, complete insight to all the participants. And so the reason why I still think it's 5 years out, or at least some period of time out, is because I think a lot of companies are still trying to get good at managing their basic open source within their own organization and maybe one hop with one immediate supplier. I don't think people are ready yet to go that route, to actually want to coordinate. They would like to have that kind of information, but I don't think they're ready to participate at that level where they're all working off of a blockchain. But the blockchain technology is very critical to enabling the collection of that information, which cuts across multiple organizations.
Great. Now this next question is for Michael. Does the bill of materials also provide an assessment on risk? And if so, to what degree?
Sure. So this is a loaded question. So let me answer it this way. Different parties have different interests when it comes to the bill of materials. Bill of materials actually is the assessment of risk, and it contains all these ingredients, as Mark mentioned. So risk can be different, depends on who looks at it, who looks at that bill of materials. For example, for someone who is an IP attorney handling an M&A transaction and responsible for open source technical due diligence, the bill of materials will be looked at with respect to managing the license compliance risk. Now, that would be their focus. For someone who's in security, for example, who's a security expert in a company, they may not care about the license compliance risk. They will care about the security risk. So they will look at the bill of materials from with respect to the security vulnerabilities and other security issues. issues there. At the end of the day, the bill of materials represents the assessment of risk, and it really depends on the individuals looking at it and his or her role. You have to do your due diligence internally to determine what is it that you want to focus on and how you want to act on it.
Great. I believe that is all the time we're going to have for today. I'd like to thank you guys again for a great presentation. That was Mark Giese, Director of Open Source Programs at Wind River Systems, and Michael Lipchuk, Manager of Professional Services at Flexera. I'd also like to thank Flexera for sponsoring today's webinar, as well as the attendees for joining us today. Until next time, I'm Christina Cardoza, news editor of SC Times.